All right, well, we'll turn to Genesis 22. Genesis 22. I don't know that we'll be able to cover all of it tonight, because this is a pretty important chapter in the Bible. And so, but we're gonna plug into it and start working through it a bit. So have you ever had something that you were made to give up? Ever had something that you had to give up, that you had to give away? Probably. Do you remember how disappointed you probably felt? You know, over the summer we had VBS, and Derek Winkowicz and I were in charge of the Bible lesson time. And the first lesson that we had was about Zacchaeus. Now, the book had an activity as part of that lesson. We gave out a bag of candy, and then we taxed the candy. We ended up taking every single piece away from them. We gave them a bag of 4 pieces, and we went and taxed it once, and then a second, and a third, and a fourth time. Took every single piece away. That didn't make us friends with any of the kids, even though we eventually gave back all the candy at the end. I still have a few kids who come up to me and tell me that they remember how I took their candy from them. So now I tend to walk around with candy in my pocket whenever I'm out at the schools, just so when they come up, I'll be like, and here you go. But candy is nothing compared to what Abraham was asked to give up in this chapter. Now, as far as events go in Genesis, we most likely all know about creation, the fall, Noah, and this one event, and probably as well as Joseph. But this event ranks towards the top. And why is that? Well, let's find out. I'm going to read through the whole chapter. It says, "After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, 'Abraham.' And he said, 'Here I am.' He said, 'Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you.' So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him, and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, 'Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship, and come again to you.' And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, 'My father.' And he said, 'Here I am, my son.' He said, 'Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering?' Abraham said, 'God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son.' So they went both of them together. When they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, 'Abraham, Abraham.' And he said, 'Here I am.' He said, 'Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me.' And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram, caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, 'The Lord will provide,' as it is said to this day, 'On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided.' And the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, 'By myself I have sworn, declares the Lord, because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you, and I will surely multiply your offspring as the stars of heaven and as the sand that is on the seashore. And your offspring shall possess the gate of his enemies. And in your offspring shall all the nations of the earth be blessed, because you have obeyed my voice.' So Abraham returned to his young men, and they arose and went together to Beersheba. and Abraham lived at Beersheba. Now after these things it was told to Abraham, Behold, Milcah also has borne children to your brother Nahor. Uz his firstborn, Buz his brother, Kemuel the father of Aram, Kesed, Hazo, Pildash, Jidlaph, and Bethuel. Bethuel fathered Rebekah. These 8 Milcah bore to Nahor, Abraham's brother. Moreover, his concubine, whose name is Reumah, bore Tebah, Gaham, Tahash, and Maacah. All right. You know, next time if you guys don't have questions, I'm going to make you read those names. All right. So God is first testing Abraham. Some have asked if God is tempting Abraham. Do you hear the difference there? God is told to be testing Abraham. Some have asked if he is tempting Abraham. And if so, then it would contradict James chapter 1. Turn to James chapter 1 just for a second. Keep your finger in Genesis. James chapter 1, verses 13 to 15. James 1, 13 to 15. I'm going to start in verse 12, actually. It says, Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. Now look at verse 13 here. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. So we see that God doesn't tempt anyone. And so he wasn't tempting Abraham then in Genesis 22. So what does it mean then? Let's come back to Genesis. What does it mean that God was testing Abraham? What does it mean that God was testing Abraham?
He was testing just to see how faithful he would be to him.
Yeah, testing to see how faithful he would be to him. Yep. Yeah. And notice the difference between testing and tempting. Out of James, tempting was something that happens that gives birth to sin eventually, right? And so tempting leads to sin. Testing, especially in this case, should lead to greater faithfulness. So we see that God was putting Abraham through a test of what he has learned about God and the faith that he has put in him. He does not do this in order to bring him to fall or to fail, even though that could have been a possibility. He does not do this to bring to light hidden sins. And he doesn't do this to uncover the evil in Abraham either. No, God does this so that he can make apparent the work that he has done in Abraham's life and the good that he has accomplished in Abraham's life up to this point. You know, I've talked about Genesis 22 being kind of the capstone of Abraham's faith, his faith journey, all the way back from Genesis 12 when he was first called. He did not have that faith that could be tested until Genesis 22, and he had quite a few years in between to get to this point. And notice, too, that this test originated with God and not the devil. The devil would have seemed a logical conclusion, right? After all, that test that was being given to Abraham seems to contradict the promises that God had given Abraham, right? He had promised Abraham offspring as numerous as the stars in heaven, and he specifically said that Isaac will be the one through whom it will be fulfilled. And so the logical choice here, if we didn't know that God was the one who was testing Abraham, we would have thought, okay, we're going against God's promises here. We might have thought the devil. But we're told that it's God, and Abraham put full faith in God and leaned on him. Now look at verse 2 That was all just verse 1. All interesting, right? Verse 2. What is God emphasizing as he describes Abraham's relationship with Isaac? I'll read it. He said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah." What is he emphasizing in his relationship with Isaac? His only son, what'd you say? Who he loved, right? This description, I think, is to help Abraham see how much he has grown to love his son, and also the joy that he had in him. Now we may wonder, how could God demand a human sacrifice when we know that he's opposed to this? We know that life is sacred, and God even said that he will demand an account for all the blood that is shed. He said that all the way back in Genesis 9. So how could he ask Abraham to offer up his son? Right, yep. He knew he was going to spare him. Mm-hmm. It was to test Abraham, specifically his faith, right? Right.
But I think Abraham had the faith that if God did allow him to kill his son, that somehow he was miraculously going to be alive or something.
Right.
Because he had told him through Isaac.
Yeah. Yep.
So Abraham had faith.
Yep. So if you didn't hear that, Abraham didn't know that God would spare Isaac. But even if Isaac did die, he had faith that God would somehow miraculously raise him, because God had told him that it was through Isaac that he would fulfill the covenant. See, what God actually wanted Abraham to give as this sacrifice was more of a spiritual sacrifice of his son. God asked for one thing and one thing only, really: the spiritual surrender, the giving back to him of this great gift that he had given to Abraham. The only way to do that was to go through the physical motions of a sacrifice. See, if God required a physical sacrifice, he would not have intervened at the last moment. He was requiring a spiritual sacrifice, because what could have happened here was Abraham could have propped Isaac up on this pedestal, right? He's 100+ years old at this time. Sarah is 100+ years old at this time. And Isaac is their only son. You know how we can start to worship the gift instead of the giver, right? That's what the temptation was for Abraham here. Abraham is directed to go to the region of Moriah. And a very interesting thing to know is that this location has great significance later in Israelite history. In 2 Chronicles 3, verse 1, we find out that Solomon built the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah. So this kind of comes back, right? This wasn't a coincidence. God was marking this location as special. And then God commanded Abraham to offer Isaac as a burnt sacrifice. Now this type of sacrifice signifies complete surrender to God. There's no going back from this if it was to occur, right? I mean, burnt sacrifice is you're burning the sacrifice to ash. You know, I mean, that's kind of like a complete, it's gone. The words are from a root Hebrew word that mean to go up. This is a smoke, as in the smoke of a sacrifice. So the son given to Abraham is to be given back to God without any reservation at all. That is the test that is laid before Abraham. You can't do anything partial here. It is all in or nothing. Now, knowing that God waited 25 years before providing a son for Abraham, how would you expect Abraham to react to God's instructions that he gave in verse 2? Yeah, are you kidding? Yeah. Yeah, he didn't ask Sarah. Isn't that interesting? Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's some interesting things that we'll talk about in the next chapter about this too. Yeah. He doesn't talk to Sarah at all about this.
She has no idea what's going on here.
hmm You know, an interesting thing that I thought of with this too is Abraham didn't know that that Isaac would be spared. Are there times in our lives that God has told us to do something, even things that may have contradicted what we thought we knew about him, and we're like, no, he couldn't have meant that. That's not who God is. Because that's what's happening here. God is asking Abraham to do something that lies outside of what God would have regularly expected, right? God wouldn't say, sacrifice a human. But he still tells Abraham to do this, and Abraham still puts faith in him, right? So are there times in our lives when that has happened? That it doesn't seem to jive with God's character, but we still trust in God anyway? Many times, I'm sure, it might not happen, in everyone's life, but I think a lot of times in people's life that if something like this happened, they'd first blame it on the devil or sin or the world, right? If something lies outside of God's character, then it must not come from God. Sometimes, though, we have to have a discerning faith. Maybe it's still coming from God, and we just haven't learned how or why yet. Anyways, let's look at how Abraham reacts. Look at verse 3. Verse 3 says this: So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him. Your version might say young servants with him, and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering, and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. Now, why do you think Abraham doesn't object at all? What? Okay. Yeah, so Obadiah said that he thinks there's 2 reasons. One, God is the one who's literally telling him to do this, right? He's learned by now that you don't question God. And 2, to respect your elders. What do you mean by that one? Okay, sure. He's supposed to do what God says. Yeah. Do you see any emotions, Abraham? Any hesitation? Any weeping? Not that we're told. Yeah, we may want to read some emotion into it, though, right? He could have been heartbroken. He could have been confused. He could have been nervous. This could have been heart-wrenching. But we don't know what Abraham is feeling. And so, Right? So, yeah, he rose early, wanted to get it over with, maybe? Yeah. But what we do see is Abraham's complete obedience, right? In fact, we see prompt and absolute obedience from Abraham. This is how strong his faith is. He doesn't question God's commands. He simply follows them. But every step taken was both intentional and it had that end result in mind. I mean, he got up early. He loaded up his donkey. He brought 2 young men to help. He definitely brought his own son Isaac. He cut enough wood for the offering. I mean, think of each motion that he has to go through. I mean, this isn't just one huge act of obedience. This is steps of obedience leading up to that one act. Imagine knowing that each piece of wood you cut would be used for the purpose of sacrificing your son. I mean, oofta. And finally, he sets out towards the region of Moriah. Let's look at verses 4 and 5. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you." Now, of course, it took some time to get there because it says that on the 3rd day, Abraham saw where he was supposed to go. Do you think that he might have felt dread? I know I'm going back to the emotions again, that we don't know what he felt, but still, Abraham's a person, right? Not just words on a page. Huh? Yeah, I'm sure he dreaded it. Yeah. Every step was taking... Yeah, Isaac might have been about 13 right now. Mm-hmm.
And he was in obedience to the seeds.
Yeah, we're going to see obedience from Isaac, that he could have, run away, struggled, but not let Abraham put him on this altar. Right. And that's a pretty logical question to have, too. Jolene said, other than questioning him where the sacrifice was, he didn't question anything else. Yeah. Still, every step was taking them closer to sacrifice Isaac. Abraham left his young men behind and said that they were going to go worship. But look at Abraham's faith at the end of verse 5. The force of it is lost a little bit from the Hebrew. But from the Hebrew it says, I and the boy will go over there and worship, and we will return to you. See, Abraham expresses his faith that they will both come back. We'll consider in a couple verses how he believes that will happen. But there's no denying, I think, this expression of faith. Verse 6. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife, so they went both of them together. Okay, so we find out a few more details of the steps that Abraham obediently took to accomplish God's will. Each successive step is bringing him closer to sacrifice. Each step builds on the tension of this situation. And again, Isaac is probably stronger than Abraham by now. In fact, I was looking at this. He could have even been as old as 18 to 20. Okay, so we don't know exactly the range. Some say 13, some say 20. But he could have handled the load of wood while Abraham was about 120, 125 years old at this time. But Abraham did carry the two things that would be used in the act of sacrifice. The fire, which is most likely a container of live coals, and then the knife. Yeah, he carries the wood. Yep. So both, you see a lot of parallels now between what's happening with Christ and what's happening with Abraham and Isaac. And we're going to see a lot of these too as we go throughout this, because this situation right here is what God says. Oh man, I just lost my train of thought. Exactly along that point, though. We're going to see the same thing with Christ. Yep, one and only son, both carrying their own wood for the sacrifice. Yep. And even when he's talking to Abraham about Isaac, he says, your only son Isaac, whom you love. What does God say about Jesus when he's being baptized? This is my son, whom I love. In him I am well pleased. Yeah, so there's huge things going on here. A situation that Abraham doesn't really understand the full implications of this. And how could he? He didn't really know of what God was going to do through Christ. This has huge implications in their life. In verses 7 to 8, Isaac has a light bulb moment. He's with his dad. He notices that they have everything for a sacrifice but the lamb. And again, he naturally wonders what's going on here. Now, it must have been hard for Abraham to hear his son say, hey, Dad. I mean, it's a relational term here in the Hebrew. And the question he asks is very innocent. Isaac did not know what was going on. He was just trusting his dad. His dad was just trusting God. And Abraham responds by sharing his faith with Isaac. He sidesteps the question. And he reiterates what he himself most likely thought. God will, provide. This is at the basis of our faith. God will provide, right? God provides for our salvation. God provides for our needs. God will provide for our eternity. God as provider is probably the ultimate expression of faith that we can give because he has provided everything for us. Now, a question that we have to wrestle with is, what did Abraham think was going to happen? We've talked about that. What do you think that Abraham thinks is going to happen? Somehow, Isaac may be raised if he does die. He said that we will return, so maybe he thinks that somehow he and Isaac will be saved from this. Any other ideas?
I think Abraham had the faith that when he told Isaac his son that God would supply the sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
I think he thought he would.
Yeah.
I really do. I think he had the faith that, and what the coincidence here is, when he's ready to kill his son, God says stop.
Yeah.
And then there is the ram.
Right. Yeah, so Dennis is saying that Abraham, because of his answer, most likely thought that God would provide a sacrifice. And that's not a coincidence that when he was about to do it, God said, stop, and there was a ram.
What was he thinking when he was ready to put the knife into his son?
Yeah, what was he thinking when he was about to put the knife into his son? It's like, God, how far are we going to take this? Yeah. You know?
But I think Abraham, all since God called him to leave the land of the Chaldees, he had different weird things happen all along the way, and every time God was there to save him from whatever it was.
Right. Whether he got into it himself or something happened to him, God was there to save him. Yep.
He really did trust that whatever God told him, he should do.
Yep. Yeah, he trusted God completely. And that's one of the huge lessons from this chapter itself, from the life of Abraham. First, out of this verse, here's a possibility. He may be thinking that God would not make him go through with the sacrifice, that there would be something else that they could sacrifice. That'll prove to be true. Second, maybe he thought of God's provision in another way. God had provided an heir once. Maybe he expected him to provide another heir after Isaac was sacrificed. A final possibility comes from Hebrews 11. Turn to that. Hebrews 11. The great faith chapter in the Bible. By faith, people did things. Hebrews 11. We're going to look at verses 17 to 19. Hebrews 11, verses 17 to 19. It says, by faith, Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises was in the act of offering up his only son, of whom it was said, through Isaac shall your offspring be named. He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back. So you see there, I'll just ask you, what's that saying? By faith, what did Abraham think would happen? God could raise him from the dead. Yeah. And see, we see just this other parallel now, right, to Christ. Abraham thought this could happen. It happened with Christ. Abraham would have thought that he would have had to follow all the way through with the sacrifice, but trusted that God would bring him back. You know how tough that would be? I mean, the amount of faith that you have to have in God to go through with being willing, fully intending to kill your own son, knowing that, okay, if I do this, I'm still trusting God that he will raise him from the dead. Maybe he... there was other possibilities in his mind, but this one, I think, is the one that we're told. Again, he had to have ultimate faith in God, that God would make all things right in this situation. He trusted God's promise for offspring. He trusted God enough to obey in this current situation, and he trusted that things would work out. And that's where I'm going to leave us for time, just because... Yep, we'll just have to stop there for time. So we're on a cliffhanger here, right? I mean, we all know what's going to happen because I read through it all, but the explanation of what's happening and why it's happening, we're going to have to pause right here.